Our basic research question is about collective identification. The world around us is full of collective identifications. Our political language is full of them. It's religious and ethnic and national and other identities. And these are also related to conflict and to resource conflict between the groups defined by these identities. What we want to find out is the dynamics of identification, which options people have in identifying with one or the other identity, and how all this is related to resource conflicts and the political contest in general. This question is by no means trivial, because very often it has been sort of answered in the form of shortcuts. There are many people who say, well, the real explanation of a problem is the material resource behind it. So if we have found out that in Northern Ireland the conflict is not really about, or not really about theology, but that Catholics and Protestants are involved in the contest of economic opportunities and political representation, they see, well, it's really about the economic opportunities. So the material resource is the real explanation. And other people talk about identity-based conflicts, as if people fought about the right to be who they are. No one contests anyone else's right to be what he is. Only if resource claims or claims of political representation are based on these identities, then it becomes a political issue at all. So, I mean, we are against both shortcuts, taking identity itself as an explanation or reducing everything to material interests, and we want to examine the interplay of the two. We do our research applying sort of the standard mix of the methods of our discipline, which is social anthropology. And social anthropology is almost defined by its core method, which is participant observation. It means that we ourselves and our junior researchers live in a given setting in Africa or Asia or other parts of the world for a long time, often in one village or one quarter of a town, associated maybe even with a given family, with a host family. They learn the local language and get involved as much as they can without pretending to be someone who they are not, participating in local life. In addition to that, the main method then for record keeping is the field diary. So people collect case histories, everyday observations, and so on, observe interaction, and keep a diary about that. In order to make sure that the observations we make are not totally idiosyncratic or untypical, we also employ sort of quantitative methods on a rather modest scale. What we do is a collection of kinship networks, which show important things also for the topic of our research, social identification, who is relevant kin, and so on. And that also opens the door to quantitative research on a modest scale. If you ask for complete sibling sets for the generation of the siblings of your father, siblings of your mother, and then you ask, what do these people do professionally, where are they now, and so on, and which religion they belong to, you get some basic statistical data about conversion, about migration, about education, and the rest of it. So, and we also do census-like methods that we collect basic information about the ethnicity and the occupation and other relevant data of everyone in a village and so on, in order to situate our research. But the focus is on what people say and what they do. So we record our interviews partly, we transcribe them, we analyze them, and so on. And we, as political anthropologists, we are, of course, especially interested in the political categories and how they talk about collective identities and identifications. The findings about our studies about collective identification in situations of violent conflict, non-violent conflicts, and so on, and rapid social change show how much these identities change and how much the relationship between those who identify with an identity and the identity in question change. You see, people change, work on their identities by re-evaluating them, by giving new value to them, and they change their own affiliation by opting for a different identity. And this can be shown on various levels. If we look at the 20th century, we can say that at the beginning of the 20th century, the dominant discourse was the class discourse. Yeah? But when the First World War broke out and Kaiser Wilhelm said, I don't know any classes, I only know Germans, the agenda was set for much of the 20th century, which became a century of nationalism, of violent nationalisms. This violent nationalism then was discredited, of course, in the aftermath of fascism, and other discourses came back in. So we had a return to class discourses. We had a new form of subnational ethnic discourses and so on. We had the legitimacy of ethnic movements exemplified by the indigenous movement, which pays special attention to smaller ethnicities, but revalues ethnicity in the political discourse also as such. It's now legitimate again to base a claim on ethnic affiliation, and more recently we had this wave of religious identification. So we had global changes in the acceptance, or you can say conjuncture, of different kinds of identity discourses, and you had local discourses adjusting to them. And a political movement or a military movement might be nationalist in one situation and religious in the next situation. Because, I mean, the opportunities to be accepted with one or the other discourse change with worldwide, call it fashions, call it sort of political atmospheres or whatever. We can say that the dynamics of identification in the political field and in the military field and in other fields of social action are very much influenced by consciously or unconsciously anticipated group sizes. If you are in a weak position, you opt for larger identities. If you are in strong positions, you want to keep whatever you have for yourselves. So, and that can be shown in political history, or it can be shown in sort of business strategies, and it's a pervasive pattern. We can say that collective identities undergo historical processes of change. Individual affiliation to these identities undergo processes of choice, which are determined by resource considerations and strategic considerations and so on. So our main result is that that what is assumed to be given in much of political rhetorics, that it is the so-and-so, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Maasai, the French, or whatever, as actors, that in fact, I mean, all these categories are fluid. If you look at the larger historical pattern, and they are subject to choices and re-identification. They change their membership because their members are strategically acting individuals. And of course, you have to distinguish between the calculations of leaders and followers and so on, because there are different incentives and different strategies involved in both roles. So this is what we want to bring into conflict studies, because we think that many answers to conflicts, and especially the explanations which we find in the media and in political debates, oversimplify all these processes. I think that knowledge of the kind we want to generate with our research about collective identification will help us to solve some political problems in the current world. If we look at the world, I mean, we do not really have a crisis which is based on technological developments. We do not have a crisis which is based on food shortage and so on. We have a problem of how we organize our human lives. There is enough food around to feed twice the number of people we have now on the world. It's only not preserved, it's not distributed in the right way, and so on. So we have all kinds of inevitable conflicts and inevitable suffering because we are not capable of organizing our social and political lives in a peaceful and productive way. And we want to make our modest contribution in analyzing and solving political problems and maybe defusing conflicts to some extent. The core issue which we find to be relevant is that the pattern of explanation which we find in the political world, namely that we do what we do on the basis of what we are. It's our social identities which determine how we think and how we tick and so on. Example, I mean, you are a Muslim, you are a potential terrorist because you are a Salafi Muslim. You see, you can, and this goes without saying, and that one has to do with the other. So this ignores all these Salafi who are in a very pietist way, sort of looking for everyday correct performance of Islamic rules and have no time to think about politics in the first thing. And it ignores the fact that in other periods, in the 19th century, I mean, other kinds of Islam were behind the jihadist states in Africa and so on. It was the Sufi brotherhoods who are now depicted as particularly peaceful and so on. What is the result if you find out that the conflict comes from a group which is called XYZ and they are bad because of what they are? What is the political consequence? Kill them all or what? I mean, this is not a political answer. You have to make a refined analysis in order to get closer to the root causes of the conflicts and so on, and then you can answer the question, what makes a Salafist, or some other person for that matter, a terrorist under which circumstances, and so on. And the rest applies to many of the current explanations of political conflicts and military conflicts around the globe. And a finer analysis of the interplay of the formation of alliances, forms of identification, and how they are related, not determined by resources, will help us to solve these problems. And once again, these are the core development problems in the world, not that we cannot grow enough food or that our technologies are not good enough. I think generally that a better understanding and more information about the social dynamics around us help us to live together. Islamophobia and fear of foreigners and the rest of it works best, and statistics show it across Germany, in the areas where there are no foreigners, you see. So I mean, this already shows the more you know and the more familiarity there is, the more solutions there will be, you see. So information is always better. I mean, discuss these things, analyze it properly, get away from labeling processes, putting people into boxes, and opening these boxes, unravel these identification processes and so on, and discuss them and talk to each other rather than about each other would help a great deal. As soon as we understand that group identifications are ultimately made by individuals who have motivations, who want success in life and so on, and you might inform small groups and so on, that it's not sort of an anonymous big group which has an identity and identification. And if we understand to which incentives these people react, it gives us a toolbox with political instruments, because we can influence these options by giving them other incentives. We understand the problems which underlie this often aggressive form of identification with some or the other militant group, and then we can do something about it. And I think that is, of course, a contribution of social science to politics, that we can sort of introduce some more rationality into these debates. In our program so far, we very much sort of treated the problem as accessible to sort of a rational kind of analysis based on rational criteria. Much of it is linguistic in terms of categorical inclusion and exclusion and the logic which combines concepts and so on. And the other part is rational choice. Why do people make such and such an option from the different identity offers around? Does it correspond, and in which way does it correspond to their interest, for the interest of those who speak, and so on. What I think has been underdeveloped so far in our, not in research in general, but in our approach to collective identification, is emotional factors like bonding and so on. There are obviously forms of bonding which you have in a combat situation or which you have in a parent-child relationship and so on, which are not matters of choice. And there are situations in which you sacrifice yourself because obviously sort of someone else's interests then are more important than your own interest, because if you sacrifice yourself for someone else, it's his cost-benefit analysis which determines your action, not your own. All these are complicated problems which have to do also with our psychological, our emotional nature, and our evolutionary history and so on. I think there is much more in terms of sort of all these unconscious factors. Then I think there are recent political developments like sort of the demographic crisis in some countries and the perceived immigration crisis. One could be a partial solution to the others, but many people don't see it that way. They perceive that as two different problems. Now there are, to some extent, you can analyze them as two different problems. So there are many very fundamental questions which are linked to collective identification of one or the other sort, which border on philosophical issues even, which I think we haven't solved yet.